You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda, here in New York City.
And this is Prashant Parmaswaran from Washington, D.C.
Good to be back with you today, Prashant. We have a lot to talk about, in particular regard to an important development in South Asia. So, on February 14th, over 2,000 Indian Central Reserve Police Force personnel were traveling in a convoy comprising about 80 vehicles on a highway in Kashmir's Pulwama district, and they were struck by a vehicle-borne improvised explosive device, and this resulted in over 40 casualties, representing the deadliest attack on state security personnel in India since 1989. The attack was claimed by an assailant who was a local from Kashmir, from India-administered Kashmir, but he identified himself with Jaish-e-Mohammed, the Pakistan-based terrorist group that's been well known for sponsoring a range of attacks on India, going back as far as 2 decades. They were involved in the 2002 attack on Indian Parliament, in the 2016 attack on Indian Army personnel at Uri, which resulted in the Indian retaliatory surgical strikes that year. They were also involved in the Gurdaspur attack, the Pathankot attack. So this group has really been at the forefront of many of these moves, and this latest attack obviously resulted in a spectacular death toll, and it's really sparked off a major crisis between these two nuclear-armed neighbors. We have not seen any Indian kinetic retaliation yet. The Indian military has not made any moves as of this recording, which we're taping on February 21st, but that's certainly been a possibility. Prime Minister Narendra Modi, shortly after the attack, said that the attackers will pay a price, and he's politically under a lot of pressure to do something, given that general elections that will test his party are just around the corner. Indians will start voting in April and May, with the results to come out in mid to late May. So this is really a crisis that's happening at a politically interesting time in India. And yeah, I think we have a lot to talk about here. But Prashant, I guess, let's just address some of the issues here. I mean, what to you really jumps out about the attack and its aftermath so far?
I mean, I think it's a lot of kind of what you summed up, which is on the one hand, I think there's a temptation always when these attacks happen to say, this is kind of more of the same from Pakistan, and the same dynamics are at play, whether it's Pakistan's behavior and its support of terrorism, the dynamics between India and Pakistan, the U.S. regional perspective. But I think this could not come at a worse time, right? So we have so many ambiguities on so many different levels. The India-Pakistan relationship is already at such a low, and we have India heading for elections and Pakistan with a new government. So much uncertainty at the domestic level in both countries. And then you have U.S. policy in the Trump administration, where you've seen, as you and I have discussed before, kind of a superficial hardening of a stance on Pakistan and some actions that are taken on security assistance, suspension, and the like. But the policy hasn't really been developed to date, and there's just so many ambiguities around that. And then there's the regional angle too, right? So this, how India and Pakistan relate and how the United States plays into this also affects things like Afghanistan and some of the peace talks that are going on. So I would say, I mean, this is something which it's coming at an interesting time from so many different lenses that it's really difficult to assess the exact significance of this on above and beyond the fact that we're talking about this, at a time when we haven't seen the full range of Indian responses. We've seen some responses to date, but I think it really remains to be seen where we're at in terms of that perspective too.
Yeah, I mean, let's talk a bit about the Indian response so far. So, like I said, Modi said that the attackers will pay a price. And, you look at the Indian media, and across the board, I think commentators on both sides of the political spectrum effectively see military retaliation as sort of a given, which in a way is dangerous given the expectations set after the surgical strikes, right? I mean, this attack is on a different level. It involved, several 100 kilograms of conventional explosives. It involved a local attacker, like I said, who expressed allegiance to Jaish-e-Mohammed, who were across the border in the Pakistani province of Punjab. That's where Masood Azhar, the group's leader, is thought to be based, and roam freely, effectively, because the Pakistani authorities don't give him much trouble. But actually, that's an important distinction here too. With attacks like Uri and Pathankot and Gurdaspur in recent years, Indian intelligence agencies had pretty good evidence that these attackers had infiltrated across the line of control, and I think in the case of Gurdaspur, the international border.
Mhm.
But with this attack, it's a little bit more different. I mean, some of our listeners may be aware, but beginning in the summer of 2016, the attraction of Kashmiri youth to a range of insurgent groups and militant groups in the region, including Hizbul Mujahideen, has really risen. So a lot of youth have turned towards these groups. And of course, there's been a feedback effect caused by the fact that the Indian army has been particularly heavy handed in recent years with its tactics in Kashmir. And of course, the political situation in Kashmir has been in flux with the BJP alliance government with the local PDP party having fallen apart not too long ago. So, really, I think there's been political developments in Kashmir that have made the environment a lot more dangerous. And perhaps what we're seeing with Pulwama is actually the beginning of a new era of an increasingly dangerous kind of insurgency, which, the expectation there would be that this will simply feed into further hostility against Kashmiris. And, I should note that after this attack, across India, just ordinary Kashmiris faced harassment and retaliation. And that's been, I think, really difficult to kind of make sense of for many Indians who've been kind of trying to make sense of what is going to happen after the Pulwama attack. But the Indian response, to go back to that, has been pretty swift. So the Ministry of External Affairs diplomatic machinery kicked into overdrive really after the attack, and I think India managed to get statements out of most major countries, most G20 countries, at least, condemning the attack and saying that they supported India. India offered its own readouts of many of these calls and meetings that happened. India briefed diplomats. Notably, India withdrew most favored nation status from Pakistan, which is symbolically important. The total, the bottom line on the economic damage done to Pakistan is not as high as you might think, given the limited trade between the two countries. But it's something that happened. Just earlier today, Nitin Gadkari, the transportation minister in India, made an announcement that I think has been a little garbled. He announced that India would be diverting some waters that were going to Pakistan from the Ravi River towards the Indian states of Punjab and Kashmir now. But that isn't really retaliation under the Indus Waters Treaty, which I think some Indians have been calling for. But, that's actually an older move that's been in play since really 2001 that's now being announced sort of opportunistically in the environment after the Pulwama attack. But yeah, the military action has not yet come. Modi has effectively said that he's given the military something of a free hand. He had this sort of comment. I don't have it exactly in front of me right now, but it was kind of concerning from a civil military perspective, just that the Indian prime minister, after a major attack like this, was sort of saying, it's in the military's hands and they'll respond at a time and place if they're choosing. That's really not how civilian control of the military is supposed to work in India. I kind of saw that as an attempt to maybe politically push some of the responsibility off of his own shoulders and towards the military. Because I think, maybe this is something we can talk about. I mean, I think the military situation here is actually pretty complicated after the surgical strikes in 2016.
Hmm. Absolutely. I mean, I think the other aspect to this that's really interesting is we had a piece actually, well, a couple of pieces actually on our site. One by Raji, which talked about sort of some of the responses that India could actually take towards these attacks. And I think essentially the conventional wisdom, which I think when these attacks occur, is you have this narrative coming out that the Indians actually have very limited options in terms of how they react. And one of the interesting dynamics that we've seen with respect to this attack is Pakistan has, unsurprisingly, I think, come out in front of this and sort of said, well, if India responds in this way, these will be the consequences that we're going to take from our side. So that's the other, I think, complicating dynamic in all of this, that you have, sort of two players that are essentially telegraphing each other's moves and sort of, what the counter reactions
Right.
might be. And as you said, I mean, there's symmetrical ways to react to this, and then also asymmetrical ways. So we've talked about some of the economic levers in the relationship, talk about, water, economics, trade, and the like. But the fact is, as we both have discussed before, India-Pakistan relations on the economic side are already so limited. So it's very difficult for the Indians to take a very concerted response that would actually change Pakistan's decision-making calculus. But I think one of the things that's been really interesting is, I mean, we talked about briefly about U.S. policy, and I'm wondering what your take is on this about, the Trump administration. We saw Trump tweeting out in the new year, sort of a tougher approach towards Pakistan. Do you see from a U.S. perspective the Trump administration stepping up its response in reaction to what Pakistan is doing, or will we see, given the fact that the U.S. has to balance considerations in Afghanistan, for example, with how it's dealing with the South Asian dynamic, that won't really change that significantly?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there. On one hand, we should probably talk a bit about how India kind of views the U.S. role anytime anything happens in Kashmir. India really wants full-throated support from Washington for its own position. It does not want Washington to ever step in and offer its services as a mediator. And the
Hmm.
Trump administration hasn't done that, right? We have comments from President Trump, I think in 2017, where he, kind of made an offhand remark that he would maybe look at mediating in Kashmir, and people in India got worried about that. But that hasn't happened. There was a conversation between the national security advisors Ajit Doval and John Bolton, and the Indian readout was really kind of effusive about what Bolton had said. As far as I know, we don't have a U.S. readout that supports the Indian readout of that call. But these things are always a little tricky. I mean, Bolton might have said that, oh, we support your position. Of course, you have a right to respond, and then India might take that to mean that the U.S. backs a military response, which is two different things. But look, I mean, Washington right now, as you know, is pretty distracted, and I think doesn't really have the bandwidth at a high level to really deal with something like this in Asia right now. We have a summit with North Korea coming up. We have a trade deadline coming up at the same time at the end of this month. I mean, India-Pakistan tensions, I think, are something that's... I mean, look, after Pulwama, it actually took a few days for the U.S. to really do anything significant. There was a State Department statement pretty early on, which was actually quite forceful and mentioned Pakistan by name. Which I think is enough for New Delhi, but I really don't think the U.S. is going to play a major role. One of the things we should talk about, with the Indian retaliatory moves, another issue that's now coming to the fore is the listing of Jaish-e-Mohammed leader Masood Azhar pursuant to United Nations Security Council Resolution 1267 as a global terrorist. That's something that India has sought for years, but China, using its position on the Security Council as a permanent member, has exercised its veto in a technical way to prevent Azhar from being listed. And that's been something that India's brought up with China multiple times, but Beijing hasn't changed its position on that. This time, however, it's not the United States that's taking the lead at the Security Council. According to some recent reports, it's going to be the French, which I think is an interesting development. That the French are choosing to do this on India's behalf. I think it speaks probably quite well to India's diplomatic efforts with France in recent years. Everything with the Rafale scandal to the side for a moment. But that's something that's now, I think, going to come up. And it'll be interesting to see how China acts. I mean, we have no indication that China's changed its policy on this front, especially given statements out of the Chinese Foreign Ministry. But that's another issue to watch. But yeah, I mean, the United States is really not present in a way that you might have thought under a previous administration. And I think for New Delhi, that's actually not the worst thing, given the kind of political statements that we already have in support of India's position.
Hmm. Absolutely. And what do you think about you've written about this before. I mean, this is coming at a very interesting time from a regional perspective too. I mean, you have the ongoing Afghan peace talks that are continuing, and then you also have I guess the very interesting and maybe not so opportune visit of the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who had planned before the attacks had happened, a visit to Pakistan and then over to India and China. And we're seeing some statements coming out relating to his role, obviously not directly with respect to these attacks, but also, I guess, showcasing some of Pakistan's other relationships above and beyond what India has with Pakistan, right?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, beginning with the Afghan talks issue, so there was an interesting incident just a couple days ago where Pakistan's ambassador to Afghanistan pretty directly hinted that, if India takes any military action, that could derail the talks with the Taliban, which was obviously, I mean, immediately condemned by Kabul and, really, I think shows Pakistan's kind of opportunistic use of its influence over the Taliban. When convenient, Pakistan will say that really we don't have any control over the Taliban, but, obviously they're willing to acknowledge it when politically opportune. And this came after Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan's offer to India. Imran Khan took a few days to kind of stew after the Pulwama attack, and then he finally put out a statement saying that, look, India needs to give us evidence and we'll investigate this in a joint forum. And India really has no interest in that, given the experience of Pakistani investigations, especially after the Pathankot attack, and going back further even to the 2008 Mumbai attack. So that's that issue. It's not surprising that Pakistan would try to leverage the Afghan talks issue. I think that actually probably gets Washington's attention more at this point than anything else. given how much the Trump administration has really got stakes right now in these talks concluding successfully. Mohammed bin Salman's trip, I mean, I think was a bit of a tactical surprise, I guess. He was always scheduled to travel to the region. After the attack, he delayed his trip by a day, which I think gave some people pause, thinking that he might actually cancel his trip, given that he doesn't want to jump into the middle of this mess. But he went through with it ultimately. His joint statement with Imran Khan in Pakistan, I think, raised some eyebrows in India because it explicitly referred to the idea of not politicizing the designation of terrorists at the United Nations right after this attack. So I think people in India, I mean, rightfully saw that as a snub. And then the question was, how would India react to Mohammed bin Salman coming to New Delhi? And, fun fact here is that he didn't actually fly from Pakistan to India. He flew back to Saudi Arabia and then flew back to India just to kind of thoroughly decouple the trip. I've done worse routings on my trips to Asia at some point, but, that's just a little ridiculous. And then, he was greeted warmly at the airport by Modi, and that kind of kicked off the trip on a good note and kind of showed that India wasn't really willing to hold its relationship with Saudi Arabia hostage to issues with Pakistan. And the joint statement that India and Saudi Arabia signed has a little bit of something for both countries. I mean, the Saudis actually managed to get an Indian acknowledgement of, I believe the exact language made reference to terrorist use of missiles and drones, which is a pretty direct reference to what Saudi Arabia sees as the Iranian proxy Houthis in Yemen, who have a lot more autonomy than they, are sometimes given credit for. They're not necessarily a proxy group of the IRGC or anything like that. But in exchange, they also got Saudi Arabia to lend some support to India. I don't believe there was a direct mention of Pakistan in the context of terrorism in that statement, but for all things considered, it was an important statement. And of course, the big headline in India was that, Mohammed bin Salman promised something ridiculous like $100 billion of investment, which is probably never going to actually materialize. But I think it actually shows that the India-Saudi relationship is maturing to a point where, something like Pulwama can happen and India can still have a productive exchange. And of course, this is, Mohammed bin Salman's kind of image restoration tour, I guess, after the entire saga involving Jamal Khashoggi last year. So he's now off to China. So we'll see what happens on that end.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that definitely one of the the more interesting sort of instances of foreign involvement with respect to both countries, I think, with respect to the attack. So
yeah, I mean, one other thing we might talk about is India's military options. So yeah, I mean, this has been kind of one of the first things that I started thinking of after this attack. So in 2016, India carried out what it called surgical strikes across the line of control. And first of all, I should impress on listeners that in the India-Pakistan context, there's a big difference between military action taken across the line of control, which is effectively an interim demarcation between the two sides. It's not a border. It's a mutually agreed sort of demarcation of the parts of the disputed Kashmir territory that they both administer. So action across that line is very different from action across the international border, which runs primarily between the southern tip of the line of control all the way down to the Arabian Sea border between Gujarat and Sindh. So those are two different things. And Indian action in 2016 took place across the line of control. And it wasn't a first. Indian Army officers had conducted strikes across the line of control in the past, but in 2016, I think it was 19 Indian Army soldiers died in the Uri attack, and it was a major, major incident at the time, and India had to retaliate. So they retaliated, and they struck what they called terror launch pads across the line of control in Pakistan-administered Kashmir. The Pakistanis said nothing happened, and effectively it all ended there. India had a major kind of domestic victory. Modi kind of got to beat his chest. There's a movie now about the Uri surgical strikes. It's kind of a major moment of Indian pride that they responded to these attacks. From a deterrence perspective, it clearly didn't work because the fundamental challenge in dealing with subconventional actors like terrorists in a place like Kashmir is to practice deterrence by denial, not by punishment, because punishment just doesn't work to deter terror groups in the same way that it might work against a state adversary.
Right.
So what happens now is that India is again forced to retaliate, and effectively the attack would be retributive, presumably across the line of control, but given the stakes here, you have a vehicle-borne IED attack killing 40 personnel, major attack. This is something you clearly don't want to see happen again, and you want to send a message to Pakistan. India's got to go bigger. And the question is, how do you go bigger without, all sorts of things going wrong, without potentially killing a bunch of Pakistani army officers and kicking off a limited war that might not stay limited. And of course, in the context of India and Pakistan, when you think about a war escalating, you have to bring into play the role of nuclear weapons, which quickly becomes scary. And I think the Modi government is well aware of these issues. And the other question is, if you simply go back to using your surgical strikes again, you begin to look a little weak, and they're probably not going to go with that. So, some of the options that have been discussed include, using standoff missiles off of fighters, which is escalatory. Especially if you're Pakistan, you have, big kind of cruise missiles flying towards your territory. That begins to look a little bit more involved than a surgical strike. Pakistan might do what they did after Uri and simply say nothing happened. Although I think with a cruise missile strike like that, you run into the risk of kind of open source analysts and journalists simply getting evidence, right? After the surgical strikes, it was actually really interesting. I mean, nobody really had direct evidence of these attacks happening until the government made things a little bit more public and selectively leaked details to a few journalists based in India. So this is a real dilemma right now, and we'll really have to see what the Indian government is going to decide on. I think Mohammed bin Salman's trip provided a bit of a buffer. India wasn't going to do anything while he was in the region, but now that he's left, all bets are off. So retaliation could really come at any time.
Mm-hmm. And I think the point you mentioned about the fact that this is the first sort of VBIED attack, right? I mean, this is a vehicle-borne improvised explosive device. This hasn't happened before that we know of.
It's actually, according to the South Asia Terrorism Portal, there have been few attacks, not of this caliber and not of this death toll. The total death toll between 2000 and 2017 from VBIEDs in Kashmir, I believe, according to their data, was 88. And of course, this represents, a 40%, a 50% increase in those casualties. So this is significant, but it's not a totally new development. It is significant in the sense of an attack against Indian paramilitary personnel.
Right. So you were pointing to this earlier, I think, which is, that there's sort of, when these attacks happen, a sort of, one thread which says, this is kind of more of the same. We've seen Pakistan do this in the past. We just have to wait for the Indian reaction, and, around and around we go. But there's also, indications and folks that are a little bit more worried, suggesting that this may suggest a newer phase where India-Pakistan relations and tensions may actually heighten to a more significant degree, and we can expect more of this in the future. I mean, how should we think about that question, and what are the variables at play? Obviously, still very early days, and we haven't really seen the full response from either of the sides, but it seems to me that's one question that kind of is looming, right?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, look, the militant landscape in Kashmir has changed pretty dramatically in the past few years. And of course, we have plenty of examples of other terror groups using these kinds of attacks where they simply influence people to their cause without directly motivating them to conduct the attack. We don't exactly know the motivation behind this attack. There have been a few interesting reports. Saika Datta, writing at the Asia Times Online, cited sources in the Indian intelligence services noting that one of the early Indian hypotheses behind what drove the attacker in this case was that Ibrahim Azar, who's Masood Azar's brother, recently lost his son in Kashmir in an encounter with Indian forces, and this attack was effectively revenge for that, right? So that tells a very different story than this attack being sort of directed by elements within the Pakistani intelligence complex, right? If this is simply a Jaish-e-Mohammed leader seeking personal revenge on the Indian army for something that was done to his son, right? Those motivations can be warped a bit. But, keeping in mind the changes in the militant landscape, we could get to a point where many of these younger militants and rebels that have taken up guns against the Indian army begin to conduct attacks, of a varying degrees of sophistication. Most of these attacks simply involve small arms and sometimes occasionally grenades and things like that. And then they declare themselves as sort of, fidayin or, suicide fighters for Jaish-e-Mohammed. And then what happens is that every time one of these encounters happens, you sort of get a major India-Pakistan crisis, because anytime you have the name Jaish-e-Mohammed linked to any attacks, what immediately goes off in New Delhi is, this is Pakistan, Pakistan, Pakistan. And, the details of that I think are worth parsing out a bit, because India is in a way correct that obviously Pakistan is harboring Jaish-e-Mohammed and allowing it to conduct its leadership operations there, at least without, with impunity. So regardless of what happens and how these attacks are attributed in India-administered Kashmir, that side of the equation doesn't change. So I think that's something that we should probably pay more attention to going forward.
Yep, absolutely. I guess we'll have to just see how this plays out.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think we've about covered all this ground. If and when there is any further action on this, we'll come back to it. But I guess, Prashant, in the meantime, we should probably get ready for the North Korea-U.S. summit next week in Hanoi. So we'll probably talk about that on the next episode. But good to have you back with me. Thanks for joining me.
Likewise, yeah. Good to be with you.
Great. For listeners, if you like what you heard on the podcast and you want to get more of this, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you've been a subscriber for a while but you haven't yet left us a review on either iTunes or Google Play, please go ahead and do that. It really helps get the word out about the show. So thanks a lot for listening, and we'll be back next week with more.